I'm pleased and honored to introduce Frances Fox Piven. Fran, for people who are new to her work, there's a lot of things I could say about Frances. So when I make the list of the best books I read in graduate school, on that list is Frances Fox Piven and her late husband Richard Cloward's book, Poor People's Movements. One of the best books I read when I was in graduate school. It also happens to be one of the best books to read if you're on the left or progressive or someone who's interested in how social change happens in America, how progressive change can occur, how at some special moments in history, this sorry nation has achieved actual progress. On top of that, Frances wrote that book out of being involved in movements and movement struggles. She was a founding member of the National Welfare Rights Organization. She was involved in the civil rights movement. She's been a speaker for so many sort of innumerable causes, and maybe one of which is why we bring her here tonight and why it's now kind of an anniversary that we do this around elections, which is Frances has been a tireless fighter for voter rights and voting rights in the United States. Obviously, the fight to expand the electorate was to some degree inspired by the civil rights movement and the attempt to expand the vote and to enfranchise the huge number of people who've been disenfranchised by Jim Crow. But over time, activists have realized that the extraordinary low rates of voter participation in the United States, even after the massive expansion that occurred after the civil rights movement, are both exceptional. They lead to some of the conservatism that the political structure in the United States has, and they're also not an accident. And so Fran wrote, I think, the definitive book on the subject, Why Americans Don't Vote, which is where the title for the event comes from, on why so few Americans vote and all the obstacles in the way of this actually being a democracy. And on top of that, Fran maybe, I don't want to impugn anyone else in this room, but certainly more than me, has actually gotten legislation passed that attempted to address the problem. So she perhaps will talk a little bit about the fight for the Motor Voter Act, which is when you are in any government institution in the United States, like if you're going to get a driver's license or a state ID, they have to offer you the chance to register to vote, and that is because of Fran's work.
But they don't do it.
But they don't do it. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about more. I'm just so pleased to have Frances with us tonight.
Well, I'm glad to be back. As Jeremy said, I seem to come here every year about this time. But this year is stranger than ever. It is a really weird moment in American politics, and it's also a frightening moment in American politics because of the uncertainty. We don't know what is going to happen. I'm an academic, a political scientist, and when political scientists try to predict the future, they basically project the past and say, well, it's not going to be very different. Or if it is going to be different, it's because of a pattern with which we're familiar, that when the economy takes a dive, people blame incumbent politicians, and so they vote against them, and we can predict that. You can't predict anything now. That, and my entire life, which is a long life, I don't know of another moment that was so uncertain, so full of horrifying risks as this particular moment. I would think it would make you all into political junkies. It's made me into a political junkie in the sense that the first thing I do in the morning is go to my computer to see what happened since I last looked. Because things keep happening. So when we think about what we're really afraid of, most afraid of, what do we think of? Well, global warming, right? The oceans are rising. The predicted temperatures in central China are temperatures human beings can't survive. The fires are burning all over California. The waters are rising in coastal areas like Florida. And meanwhile, things are getting worse for lots of Americans as inequality grows more extreme. We have more billionaires and we have more poor people. Now, those kinds of problems are problems that governments have to solve. When you think about, well, can we do anything about global warming? Maybe, but we need a strong and definitive government that can crack down on the fossil fuel industry, for example, and on the financial interests that are intertwined with the Koch brothers and other fossil fuel investors. Or when we think about inequality, as extreme as the inequality in the United States has become, well, that requires government action too. We want a wealth tax, income taxes, and we want to redistribute some of the wealth that has been sucked out of the society to the people on the margins, on the bottom, who are suffering. So that's also something. Government has to do that. Well, if government has to do it, our problems become problems of political power. We have to make government do it. We need to acquire the political muscle to force government action. And to force government action in the face of interest groups that have become more crazed, more desperate, wilder, because they're afraid that they won't be able to take their wealth out of the ground. So how do we get political power? Well, through elections, isn't that how? That's what we've always learned, and there's even a little bit of truth in it. Moreover, last week, we had an election. Results were not bad. In Virginia, the Democrats are not the good people, and Republicans the bad people. As a general rule, this just at this particular moment, we want Democrats in power because we want to stop the fossil fuel interests. We want to stop that infantile, personality disordered person who is our president. I hope I haven't offended any of you, but he's a problem. So last Tuesday, the Democrats won both houses in Virginia. It was not a big election. It was not. It's not only an off-year election, but it's an odd year in the off-year elections. So there weren't many big stakes in the election, but Democrats did take both houses in Virginia. They won lots of down ballot races, lots, which probably has to do with people like you deciding in your jurisdiction that you're going to run for, alderman in some little dinky town or something like that. Mississippi, of course, stayed Republican, but Nate Silver, who has become everybody's guru in predicting elections, he just uses numbers to do that, not insight. Anyway, he thinks for the first time he has said that the Senate is up for grabs. Because the Senate is Republican and it's harder to win Senate races for upstart Democrats. So that's good because you probably know this, we can't get rid of the president. We can impeach him, but we can't force him out without a Senate vote. We may not be able to force him out with a Senate vote because the man he's also kind of desperate. He doesn't want to go to jail. If he isn't president, he could go to jail. Anyway, so this election was sort of important for an odd year election. Nevertheless, if elections are how we're going to force government to act on problems which determine our survival as a species, then we got problems because electoral democracy doesn't work very well generally. Jeremy brought up some developments in Latin America over the last few days. The attempted coup, it is a coup, the coup by the military in Bolivia, forcing Evo Morales to step down, and also the incredible boldness with which the right in Brazil has stopped Lula, really, from running for the presidency, and who knows what's going to happen to him. So, doesn't work very well in many, electoral democracy doesn't work very well in many places, but the United States, despite our illusions about the U.S. being the paragon of democratic arrangements, democracy does not work very well here. And we have to understand that. I want to talk about that for a few minutes because I also think that while I'm very critical of electoral representative democratic arrangements in this country, I also think that the idea of electoral democracy was inspirational. It was an incredible idea. And it's still maybe it's the most transformative idea of the modern era. Here's what people came to believe. The Chartists in England, the radical Democrats in the United States, but people all over the world still believe this. In places like Jamaica, for example, where they risk their lives in the fight for the right to vote. So, what is that idea? What is it about? Well, the model of electoral representative democracy developed in the 18th and 19th century at a time of horrifying inequality in the United States and in Europe. People starved. They lived in horrific slums, and many people, and other people, of course, displayed dazzling riches as they pranced around the towns in their coaches and so forth. So, and that inequality both reflected and was both the result, and it created enormous inequalities of power, because what why do people have power? Some people have power over other people. Well, usually it's because they have some kind of wealth, or they have recourse to force. They have guns, or they're big guys and they can punch you, intimidate you. Those are the main reasons that some people have power over others, sometimes many others. And that kind of raw power from wealth and force, concentrated wealth and force, characterized societies on both sides of the Atlantic. And this idea was born in this context, in the context of horrifying inequality. And what was the idea? The idea was maybe a separate sphere could be created that would be protected from interference by our awful, unequal society with kings and queens and generals and so forth. But in this sphere, where they can't transgress, they can't interfere, in this sphere, everybody, you, me, will have the vote, or almost everybody will have the vote. Not little kids and not people who are obviously insane, but almost everybody will have the vote. And each vote will have the same weight. It will, one person, one vote. And those votes, those voters who have this resource, this equal resource in this protected sphere, we will give these enfranchised citizens the right to speak freely, the right to print pamphlets and books and so forth, the right to assemble, to have big meetings, air their thoughts and so forth. And then we will have periodic elections where these people can come and cast their votes. And we'll have a formula for translating those votes into representation, so that if you win by 100,000 votes, you get a legislator at the seat of government. And then we will also have rules which will ensure that government officials are exposed to these elections, that they will lose their job if they don't win elections. And that's a kind of paradise, isn't it? Imagine this idea developing in the context of a history of extreme inequality that causes horrific suffering and absurd displays of wealth. So the enthusiasm for this arrangement, this electoral representative democracy, the enthusiasm for this arrangement was expressed in a way by a famous poem by Percy Shelley that became a kind of anthem of the English Chartist movement. And the poem's distinctive line was, "Ye are many, they are few." The very fact that we have numerous enfranchised citizens will make us the dominant force in our societies. That idea, doesn't that excite you a little bit? It was exciting. It was mind-boggling. And it also was very threatening to the people who were on top at the time, the aristocrats and the manufacturers and the bankers. And they resisted the efforts by movements like the Chartist movement or the radical Democrats in the American Revolution, the efforts to create institutions which would contain the provisions of the ideal. Everybody has a vote, the votes are counted equally. So, but there were moments when the many became more important. These were often movement moments, but the American Revolution was such a moment. Now, there's an enormous amount of material that's been written about the American Revolution, why it occurred, what interests were revolutionary interests, what interests were reluctant to sever ties with Great Britain. But I happen to think that severing ties with Great Britain was very important to American economic elites. When I say American, I mean elites in the American colonies. They wanted independence, and they didn't want to pay British taxes, and they didn't want to have to conform to the trade rules that the Parliament was trying to impose on businessmen in the colonies. But you know, these elites, these big landowners and merchants, they couldn't fight a war. They didn't want to fight a war. There weren't enough of them. And in any case, they didn't want to get killed. They wanted the ordinary people to fight the war. They wanted the dirt farmers and the artisans and the workmen and the sailors to fight the war. And to do that, to enlist ordinary people in the fight for independence from Britain, you couldn't just have an agenda that had to do with commerce. So, and the agenda that evolved at this moment in our history was a radical democratic agenda. So the ordinary people who formed the cadre of the Revolutionary Army, they wanted democracy. That's why they were going to war. They even had schemes to make officers in the Revolutionary Army subject to elections. So you would get to be a sergeant or a captain if you were elected by the rank and file soldiers that you were leading. Now, this Revolutionary War was a time when the ideas about radical democracy flourished and spread, and some of the ideas were really very good. For example, legislators, state legislators, in some of the constitutions that were passed at this moment in our history, they were elected for one-year terms only. And what was the reasoning behind that? It wasn't that people liked voting so much. It was rather that you could throw the bastards out if they did not follow the will of the voters. And we don't want to keep them in office any longer than we have to. Or provisions which, for an audience of ordinary citizens, had to be allowed into the legislative chambers to watch what they did, because you couldn't trust your representatives. This was a good idea. But it was a period in American history of a kind of thriving, agitating development of the democratic ideal. And a number of state constitutions were written during this period reflecting those aspirations. When the Revolutionary War was won, the British left, the American elites, the colonial elites, they kind of tried to recoup, to recover some of what they had been forced to cede to the revolution, to the people who were fighting the war. And when the form that this took, or the main form that it took, was the writing of a national constitution, which overrode the state constitutions, which reflected the fiery ideals of the revolution itself. This constitution that was written, it diluted the franchise, the right to vote, through the Electoral College, which everybody became aware of in the 2016 election, when they discovered that a 3 million vote victory in the popular vote did not offset a victory in the Electoral College by Donald Trump.
Not to mention Bush's election.
Yes, that's right. 2 elections in recent memory. And the Electoral College was very much tilted in favor of landed property instead of people. That's how that happened. The Constitution also provides for multiple veto points to check the unbridled aspirations of democratic masses. There are all sorts of ways in which you can stop the translation of democratic grievances or democratic hopes into legislation. And also, what always remains constant is the cultural force of inequality outside of the electoral representative system. It's the cultural and also the monetary force of the inequality that seeps into elections, pours into elections in the form of campaign spending, for example, or in the form of control of the mass media. So that sounds kind of grim. Electoral representative democracy is a beautiful idea, and it doesn't work well. It doesn't work well because the resistance to it is so determined, and those who resist have resources to make their resistance effective. So is it all hopeless? I don't think so. Though I have my bad moments too. I think in American political history, protest movements, have constituted a kind of hidden source of power. Now, why do I say hidden? Because I think mostly people don't think they have power most of the time. But there are moments when they discover their power. And that's one of the reasons that movements they rise up and then they collapse and then they rise up again. It's because the movements require a process of discovery and rediscovery, and there's always a lot of resistance to people discovering their hidden source of power. So what is that hidden source of power? Sounds not too credible, but I really believe that you have power and I have power. And to understand that power, you have to understand something about how we work together as a society. You can think of society and the institutions which inhabit that society as systems of cooperation. And they are systems of cooperation. Managing traffic is a system of cooperation. Getting educated is a system of cooperation. Producing stuff, selling stuff, transporting things. These are all complicated systems of cooperation, and they've become ever more complicated with globalization and automation. So everybody plays a role in those systems of cooperation. Now, this is key to the argument I'm making. I want you to notice that we usually, the conventional way of thinking about poverty, hardship, marginalization, degradation, is that people are excluded, that people are poor because they're excluded. I think that that's misleading. People are poor because they're exploited, but in order to exploit them, they have to be included. And if they're included, they do have power because they can refuse to perform their appointed roles. Now, it's very hard for people to see that they have power, or maybe not very hard, maybe it's just hard. It's noticeable, for example, that movement activists often devote a lot of their energy and their imagination to explaining to people that they have power. The group that always delights me is in American history is the Wobblies. Have you read about the Wobblies? Well, the Wobblies were really down and out workers, but they did heavy work, muscle work. They were loggers, they were seamen, for example, and they were very radical. We weren't going to push these guys around. Now, Wobblies also organized a lot of strikes, and they had a music. Their songs, there is a little red songbook of Wobbly songs. Their songs are all about what the Wobblies do that everybody else needs. So it is, we who tilled the prairies, build the cities where they reign. Without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel would turn. That's a celebration of the contributions we make to social life, without which things will stop. It's a celebration of strike power, of all kinds of strike power, not just the strike power of automobile workers or steel workers or coal miners, but of all the people who wait till the light turns red, of all the nannies who come and watch the children and cook the dinner so that those skirt-suited women who are mid-level managers can go to work. If those nannies don't come to work, those mid-level managers don't go to work, it's going to be sand in the gears of a lot of companies. So, people have power. You have power over the School of Visual Arts, for example, and you have power over the New York subway system. You made a face. You don't think so? Anyway, but I think my point is that people have power, and that power requires that they refuse, that they defy the expectations to perform their ordinary role in work, in school, in family, in community life. Now, I also think that that's a little hard to do. You need encouragement. You need to think that you're not going to get shot. You need to think that maybe you could win something. And this brings me back to electoral politics. Because, well, you know, for a long time, people on the left, I'm on the left, maybe you could tell, people on the left thought, and they argued, that electoral politics and movement politics were two separate paths, and they never crossed. They didn't meet. The people who did electoral politics thinks basically that they were susceptible to co-optation, to bribery, and you know, you can see where there was some truth to that. Just look at the Democratic Party in the last 40 or 50 years. The Clintons, Barack Obama. These were not the people's spokespeople, even though Barack did steal a few good lines from the movements. And then there were the people in the 60s, 70s, and 80s who believed in the efficacy of movements and shunned people who worked for electoral politics. There's some truth in that. There was a reason that people developed this idea of two ways to make change, one good and one corrupt. But it's too simple, because electoral politics can also be crucial to movement emergence and to movement success. In fact, I think that electoral politics can be thought of as a kind of echo chamber for movements. So, you know, movement agitators and politicians who are ambitious for elected office have constituencies. And the people that movement leaders appeal to are often the same people that the guys or women running for office have to appeal to. There's a kind of a big overlap, or can be, in their constituency. And because there is this overlap, ambitious elected politicians, or politicians who want to get elected, often end up speaking the language of movements. It may be a little bit fake. They don't care about that as much as the movement people do, for sure. They're trying to win. And because they're trying to win, they speak the language of civil rights, or of labor rights, or of gay rights. So, and when they do, they have a bullhorn, they have a big voice. Everybody pays a lot of attention to elections. And so that however sincere or however deeply felt, ambitious politicians can lift the morale of movements, can encourage people to sort of follow in line with the movement. That can be very important. The fact that John F. Kennedy in 1960 borrowed language from the civil rights movement. He had no intention of becoming a civil rights champion. He depended on the Democratic South, capital D, on the white South for election. He wasn't going to do civil rights, but he borrowed the demands of the civil rights movement for the campaign, and he got elected. Well, but that had, I mean, it's true that it was a kind of cheat. That's true. But it also communicated something that was true. It communicated to people, to black people in the South in this instance, it communicated to them that they had some power in the national government because this ambitious politician from a rich Boston family was speaking their language. It communicated something to them about, it gave them strategic information. And also elected politicians over time can become strategic partners. They're not all just finks. Well, maybe they are all just finks, but that can lead them, nevertheless, think about the successor to JFK, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He did champion civil rights legislation, and he really worked for it. And he worried that it was costing him politically in the South, because it was costing him politically in the South, but he didn't have a choice because he needed the votes of black and Hispanic people in the northern cities if he was going to carry the big industrial states with large numbers of electoral college votes. So, elected politicians can also become, in a sense, strategic partners, not because they're holy, not because they're good, but because they're ambitious. Well, is something like that happening today? Maybe the politicians, I mean, I like these politicians a lot, but they are politicians. They now control the House of Representatives, which has historically always been known as the people's house. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, my candidate is Bernie Sanders. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders are speaking the language of the movements. I don't want to cast any doubt about their character or their big hearts or anything like that, but they're speaking the language of the movements because they want the electoral support of movement constituencies. So we now have a moment when there may be a kind of convergence between electoral and movement politics that works to boost the movement, the movements. And you know, last year there was a kind of strike wave. It wasn't like the strike waves of yore. I don't want to mislead you. There were a lot of strikes in the United States after the 1930s, and then they were crushed. And they were crushed by the sort of after 1980, 1970. After 1970, the rise of the Republican right, the Reagan presidency, the mobilization of business interests, they formed new think tanks, they formed new lobbying groups, they built up Washington, D.C. K Street. How many people have been to K Street? Nobody's been to K Street.
One person. Two.
Well, you know, I used to go to Washington quite a bit in the 60s, and it was I'm from New York, to me it was a kind of hick town. And it was. Now, however, all the big companies have lobbying installations in Washington, D.C. They have vice presidents who are based in Washington, D.C. Because their lobbying is such an important part of their operation. Well, despite this, we had the largest number of strikes last year since 1986. It's a beginning. It's not enough. It's not enough because the opposition is so intent on holding us off, on keeping what they have. They're not thinking about the future because this is a new kind of economic elite with very short-term time horizons. And so they're determined to keep going, and we have to stop them. We have to stop them. We don't have any choice. Our survival is what is at stake. So now we can have a conversation.
So I always feel like it's hard for people to jump in, so I'll do it first. I'm sort of the sacrificial lamb, and then everyone else can be ready then to contribute.
I'm going to knock you right down.
I'm sure you will. So I guess one thing that comes to mind, you know, you've written in the past about sort of strategic thinking about various major problems in American politics. A strategy for ending poverty that you wrote in the 60s, a strategy for re-enfranchising voters that you have in the book, Why Americans Don't Vote. You know, kind of, this might be implicit in your talk, but what do you think, kind of what are the short-term and the long-term wins that we would have to make this a real democracy? And how do we start?
Well, to make it real democracy is a treacherous sort of phrase, I think. We have some democracy. We do. Probably going to impeach Donald Trump. Don't get too happy, though. We don't know what kind of actions that will trigger on the part of Trump and his constituency. I think that our democracy is definitely in more danger than it has been, partly because of Trump himself. He's an infantile narcissist, and he has enormous power. He could do anything. And you know, he just might. I don't know. You don't know. But we do have some democracy, and we have to improve, we have to enhance it. So it's really good that there are all of these, you probably know about them, all of these new groups that have popped up dedicated to reviving the Democratic Party. What they really mean is reviving the New Deal Democratic Party, I think. So swing left, sister district, indivisible. I mean, there are so many. A Move On was an earlier one. And they're doing good work. I mean, all those down ballot races that were won last week, a lot of them were helped a lot by these groups, making phone calls, hitting the doorbells, having little rallies. It's good. But if we want to make it more democratic, then we have a very big agenda. And that agenda has to include things like getting rid of the Electoral College. It has to include a constitution, it should include a constitutional change which would get rid of the provision which gave each state 2 senators. That's not, remember the little ideal model I tried to sketch of democracy? 2 senators from Wyoming and 2 senators from California is not democracy. What else do we have to do? We have to, I'll just make this one additional point. We have to do something to bring more people into voter participation. But that, by the way, is not just our side. That's also going to bring new voters to Trump. But I think we have to swallow that. And what did you want to say? That's a very apt and difficult question, I think. You know, if I were to name an ethnic or racial group or class group in the United States that is most committed to the voting process, I would think it would be black people. For whom the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were monumental. It came to be, those amendments came to be called the new birth of freedom. And this despite the fact that the failure to implement those amendments, or to implement them reasonably, if not fully, created the need for a civil rights movement a century later that finally seemed to have won the right to vote until the Supreme Court knocked down the most effective clause in the Voting Rights Act. So in a certain sense, we have to do it not again, not entirely again, but partly again. So remember I said earlier that this inspirational ideal of a electoral democracy had provoked tremendous resistance among elites. And of course, professional politicians side with elites. We can still see the struggle unfolding. We have not won democracy. And we have to keep on fighting for it, I think. I don't think Donald Trump would matter if he did not have the support of powerful business interests. You know, he is a jerk. He doesn't know anything. He makes a lot of terrible mistakes, and he needs to have a lot of assistance to correct them for him and for the interests that he is smoothing the way for. So he obviously has some talent in mobilizing, activating certain streams of the American population that have always been there. We have a racist society. We have ethnic hatred has always been part of our culture. We're not beautiful, but Trump is good at it. He's very good at it, and we should get rid of him for that reason, among others. But he would not be who he is if key business interests had not jumped on the opportunity that he created with this fluke victory. And something like that happened in Germany. This Adolf Hitler was sort of also a kind of jerk. I'm really not convinced by him. I've hung out with organizers all my life. I'm just not convinced of activism fatigue. I know people talk about it all the time. But a lot of my friends have been organizers for 50 years. Because, as I said, I'm old. And they don't look fatigued to me. I also would point out to you that movements, people think of movements as sort of explosions, but movements really unfold over a long time. They don't go like that. Look at the labor movement. Labor movement, I suppose it's hard to date a precise birth date, but let's say the 1870s. And it's certainly, the labor movement did not subside until maybe 1980. That's a century more. Or the civil rights movement goes way, way back. So, movement fatigue, I think that people get discouraged. But if they're doing movement stuff, and stuff is happening, it's a great life. Don't ignore that. You have lots of friends, you have some victories, not a victory every month, but you have some victories, good friends, you feel good about yourself. It's not bad. Well, I've thought about identity politics and the ways in which it does fractionalize movements. But, it also has another aspect. Identity politics gives people a sense of self, a sense of pride. I think it has contributed to movements. And Black Lives Matter is a very important movement. And of course it's a movement forged in part by identity politics. So I think we've got to learn to temper identity politics based on race and ethnicity with an identity politics based in class. And we've got to broaden our outlook, but I'm not against identity politics. And I think that, remember the critiques of Bernie based on his ignoring basically race issues? It was correct. He was ignoring them. And then he stopped ignoring them as much.
Well, he was involved in the civil rights movement, though.
Yeah, he was. He was. Are you be the teacher?
All right, yeah. Miko over here.
Well, I've always thought that socialism was, to a significant extent, an effort to bring democratic ideas to the economy, or democratic reforms to the economy. So, and everybody has a different way of doing that, a different strategy, co-ops or whatever, or public ownership, or regulation. So, however, I don't know, you might not like this, Jeremy, but I think that what democratic socialism has meant at this time in the United States, with the leadership of Bernie Sanders, is the New Deal. And maybe a little bit more than the New Deal, but you know, the New Deal was more than the New Deal because the policies that were implemented were not the whole of what the Democrats with a capital D in office aspired to, or the FDR aspired to. He had ideas about how to complete the New Deal. So, but I think that that's what it really is.
Can you just say, because I'm not sure everybody knows just a little bit more about what the New Deal was, why it was significant?
The New Deal, well, it was many things, but most significantly, the New Deal supported the millions, tens of millions of working people who were virtually destroyed by the collapse of the American economy. It gave them jobs, public sector jobs. It gave them relief checks. It gave them food. It also went beyond those obvious programs to attend to human need in significant ways. The New Deal invented the ideal community, the planned community. There are movies that you can get and show where the planned community was a community where the young children were riding their bicycles around curving roads through gardens, and the neighbors were all waving to each other, and the women wore frilly pinafores. It was, you know, the American utopian community, which was dimly reflected in the Levitt towns that went up after World War II. But the New Deal also did some fabulous things. There was a New Deal agency that it wasn't as big as WPA, for example, the Work Progress Administration. It wasn't as big as the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was not started until 1937. It was called the Farm Security Bureau. And what do you know about that agency? They created and funded agricultural co-ops, interracial agricultural co-ops, in 1937 in the South. And there's a story that I sort of feel only I know, but there's another guy who also knows because he did the research on which this story draws. A social scientist named Lester Solomon was struck by the fact that during the civil rights movement in the 1960s, there was a group called the Deacons for Defense. You know how the civil rights movement was famously anti-violent, non-violent. Well, the Deacons for Defense were black farmers who had guns, who came out to defend the civil rights protests because the civil rights movement was nonviolent. They weren't supposed to have guns. And it was important for their strategic presentation of the movement that they maintain this face of nonviolence. But nevertheless, in a number of counties, they regularly were protected by black farmers with shotguns. So Lester Solomon had the incredible idea of trying to figure out who those guys were, tracing their biography. This happened in the 1960s, and he found out that they were the black members of these interracial co-ops created in the late 1930s. That's where they came from. I think that's such a great story because, you don't always see the accomplishment of movements. Sometimes they're kind of subterranean. Maybe the teacher revolts in the red states in some ways reflected the contribution to the political culture of those states, of the mine workers and the textile workers in the 1920s and 1930s. I think it's that the experience of organized vote suppression is going to puncture the sort of hot air of people who condemn voting. It's very hard to condemn voting when there are so many efforts to prevent ordinary people from voting. I'm in favor of basic income. I don't want it to be measly. I want it to be a generous basic income. But I don't think it's necessary at this point in time to have the kind of religious imperative that everybody has to be a wage worker. Keep a full-time job and maybe a second job on the side. I think it is almost a disease. I consider it a Protestant disease, by the way, because it has a lot to do with religion. It has a lot to do with the story of the Garden of Eden. We have to work. We have to work hard for a modest income, and we have to do it because our forebears sinned in the Garden of Eden. There was a time when the Lord God intended that we all live in plenty and luxury, but we disobeyed him, and therefore we forever must be punished by punching the time clock at 7 a.m. I think it'd be good for us as a society to get over that, because everybody doesn't have to work all the time. In fact, a lot of policy people are pondering the problem of what are we going to do when we don't need all those workers? What are they going to do? Oh dear, isn't that terrible? I think they should go to the park, they should play basketball, soccer, do some painting, maybe read a book. Don't worry about it.
But to be clear, $1,000 a month is not going to
$1,000 a month won't get you anything in New York. I mean, a one-room apartment in New York is probably $3,000 a month. One bedroom, I mean, not one room. One room would be $2,500 a month. So there's a lot of cultural work to be done. I was thinking the other day about, and this has to do with basic income, about, we don't talk about this anymore, but we used to talk a lot about the emphasis in American society on consumption, on consumer stuff, on stuff. We like stuff. And, it's a kind of madness too, because as long as we want so much stuff, we're going to keep on polluting our towns and our cities. And it is crazy because not only do we have to build all these highways and have these 18-wheeler trucks going from warehouse to warehouse, and now they're going to have to do it very fast because now you have to get your stuff the same day that you order it on your computer. And then in addition to the warehouses in the Inland Empire on the West Coast and all along the New Jersey Turnpike on the East Coast, in addition to the warehouses, there are the storage facilities. So nobody can possibly afford an apartment big enough for all the stuff. So you have to rent a storage space for your stuff. Now, is that madness or not? Of course it's madness. So we have a lot of work to do. And maybe the climate crisis is a moment where we can get some sense into our heads.
When the New Deal public art was recognized as valuable contribution to society, right? Hire the artists.
Right.
I think it'll go over well with this crowd.
And they produce some wonderful art. Yes. Oh, you're supposed to do it. Well, that they're talking about it is a good sign, isn't it? Basic income is not popular in the United States, for example. But we still talk about it, and we try to show people that maybe it's not a bad idea. I would probably be open to, in the case of basic income, to pairing it with a guaranteed job, for example. Fine. And let's have a lot of people working on the things that people need. Let's have a lot of people working on building housing, affordable housing. Let's have a lot of people working on providing child care. And we need educated people to provide child care. When the 1996 law eliminating cash welfare was passed, a lot of women went from being on welfare to giving child care to the children of other women on welfare who were being forced to take jobs. So it was sort of, that was not a good idea, because this child care should be great child care. It should be child care by people who are trained, who have facilities. Anyway.
I mean,
there's a lot that we could do to improve life in the United States.
I was just going to offer one other idea, maybe, is maybe trying to make these political conversations concrete. So, i.e., saying, like, do you really want your kid to have to do all the things, to make all the sacrifices you had to make when kids in Denmark or in Sweden don't have to make those sacrifices? Do you want your cousin to have to risk their life just to get a college education? Do you want, making it less about, like, oh, that person over there who's getting a free ride while I had to work so hard, and being like your brother, your sister, your cousin, your child, that might help some with this?
Might. There's a sense of grievance that a lot of people have, especially the Trump people. They're aggrieved. They're resentful. They feel that they've lost something, that they are losing something, and that those people are taking it away from them. And those people are black people, Hispanic people. Part of what they've lost is the distinctive form of white privilege, and they should never have it back. They had no right to it. But some of the things they've lost, they should have. It's okay. They should have a decent house or housing, and they should have schools where they're confident that their kids are getting an education. There's a lot that they should have, but white privilege compensated for a lot of people for the fact that they didn't have the material things that a decent society should give its citizens. Well, I don't know that that's so important. Multi-party systems are probably better, although, the classical argument for political scientists are forever making up arguments for why the United States has the best institutions that could conceivably be invented anywhere. So political scientists have an argument for the advantages of a two-party system. And the argument is that by forcing everybody into one party or into two parties, we achieve a sort of softening of conflicts or differences. I don't think that that's particularly true. And in any case, I don't think that that's what political parties should do. They should not soften or erase the different issues that people experience. They should articulate those differences. So I think it'd be better if we had a multi-party system, but that's another constitutional, a difficult change. And so we have a lot of work to do. But let's do that too. Why not?
Any last questions, or should we say, let's say thank you to Frances?